This is the Property Development Book Club podcast. Please be advised that the views expressed are of the individuals and do not represent their employers and should not be taken as advice. Please do your own research and seek advice from an appointed professional.
Hi, I'm Hanna Afolabi. I'm founder and managing director of Mood and Space. Today we're here to discuss digitalising the planning system for season 2 of the Property Development Book Club podcast. I'm here with some great panelists, so looking forward to hearing this discussion. I'll start with Adewole. Please introduce yourself.
I'm Adewole, director at Ademolake, which specialises in property development. We are looking for sites between 1 to 20 units, and I'm glad to be part of this conversation today.
Go on.
My name's Joss Pink. I'm the managing director of Landstack. We provide a standardised set of planning data across the whole of England and Wales, helps companies find land and identify sites.
Over to you, Harry.
I'm Harry Quartermain. I'm a town planning consultant, chartered town planner. A job I've been doing for about 12, 13 years in the private sector. So I've worked in the UK and also in Australia. So I've worked for public and private sector clients across a range of development management and policy issues.
My name is Philpot. I'm Principal Planning Policy Officer at Be First, so working on delivering the local plan for Barking and Dagenham Council, supplementary planning documents, and the whole sort of suite of planning documents for the council.
Yeah, so I've got a bunch of highly skilled people here today. I guess the first question then is, to set the scene, is how does the planning system operate? And I guess that should be perfect to answer.
Yes, I mean the planning system at the moment is very much a sort of paper-based system. It's very difficult to sort of get into the sort of the data and the information that sort of lies behind planning, and it's very difficult for sort of members of the public to understand really what we're sort of as sort of local council planners we're proposing to deliver in the sort of in the borough or the council as well. So it'd be very much sort of good to sort of discuss digitising the planning system to make it more accessible for sort of members of the public and really sort of allow people to properly understand where development is happening, what that development looked like as well.
Yeah, and so Harry, what would you say then are the government's aims to digitise?
Well, first I'd like to question the premise of that question. The question was, how does the planning system operate? And I think if you listen to anyone in central government, you'd be forgiven for thinking it doesn't operate at the moment. That there are two sides to the planning system. One is plan making, and the other is assessing applications against the plan. And on both sides of that system, there are severe delays. There are plans being withdrawn due to various reasons. There's it can have delays of years and years in the making of a local plan, and then when you get to the actual assessment of applications, that can take a long time too. I'd go so far as to say at the moment we have a system of planning by appeal, because there's so much of the applications throughput that gets refused by councillors at the moment and ends up with the planning inspectorate. So the planning system is creaking at the seams right now. So the question for how does the planning system operate, I'd say it doesn't at the moment.
Fair enough.
So to answer your other question, the government's aims are to simplify and speed up the system. There's a recurring view in governments, and this isn't limited to the British government, about the English planning system, that planning is a problem that gets in the way of development and stifles investment. I, as a planner, would like to see that turned around, and planning has got the potential to be a massive enabler for development, a creator of wealth and a creator of places and environments we want to live in. So I'm hoping the government's aims are to facilitate that.
Yeah. I guess on your point around it doesn't operate, I want to kind of like switch over to Joss. Why was Landstack important then?
Yeah, so it's a very good question. Yeah, we've basically founded Landstack as more of a frustration, out of frustration, which was, this information is incredibly hard to get to, it's incredibly hard to put together as well, and incredibly hard to keep up to date. And the problem is, 320 odd different local authorities in England and Wales, that's 320 different ways of doing things. And so the reason we created Landstack was to standardise that. So irrespective of where you're looking, you get the same information, same quality, regardless of the local authority you're in, which kind of leads into sort of what Harry was saying. But I also wanted to pick up on one thing, which was when we're talking about digitising the system, who did we digitise it for? We digitised it for house builders, promoters, land agents, because if you're going to spend all this money doing that work, you need to get something out of it. But when the government think about digitising it, they need to be thinking about digitising it not just for professionals, people who also have good GIS skills. They need to think about digitising it for the public and pretty much anybody who wants to sort of be involved in planning. Which is a slight, we had to worry about probably 1/3 of the problems that if you were digitising the system, you'd need to worry about overall, because, actually, the ability for the public to see local plans, comment on planning applications, comment on local plans, interact with things, just as a single point is something we don't even need to think about. So in some ways we had a much simpler task. Yeah, I think that probably answers your question.
But so what do you think about the government's desire to digitise things?
I think I'll say there's a couple different there's a couple of different ways you can come at it. I think if there's the one approach, which is potentially people might suggest that the government, it's not in essentially local government's interest to digitise that well. I think really the reason it hasn't been digitised it probably stems more into a funding issue, a knowledge issue, and a practicality issue. It's actually, in some ways, quite difficult to design a system that has, really well digitized data. You need quite a lot of knowledge and know-how in terms of how to build servers and GIS systems that you can actually add this information to. So I think, and fundamentally, that costs a lot of money to do as well. And then if you think about 320 different approaches to that problem, some people will pick the right way and some people definitely won't.
It's a spectrum, isn't it? So you've got some councils that are doing it really well. Plymouth springs to mind. They've got up and set up appointed a data officer. They've got their data has been drawn together and then feeds into other services, which is great. Because you need, as Josh will say, you'll need the data to back up the system. If you don't have that, then you can't digitise.
No, I guess then, is it in the interest of local government to keep the planning system analogue?
I think, the local government would like to keep it analogue because it'd be less work and sort of less sort of complicated things to have to go through. But I think it's a necessity to be able to open up the information that we've got at the moment and that data.
I think, who do you mean by local government? Because is it the councillors or is it the officers? Because I think one of the issues that is present at the moment is a massive under-resource in local authorities. We're at a stage at the moment where even the planning performance agreements, which are designed to allow extra funding for applications, aren't happening because there aren't the staff to take up the funding. So with that in mind, the great opportunity from speeding up the system through digitising parts of it allows resources to be freed up. So I think actually it's in everyone's interest that there is some element of digitisation in the system to kind of grease the wheels of the process to make things happen more quickly.
I think an interesting part of it is if you digitise things well, in theory, it should make the whole process easier. And I think a lot of local people will probably feel very frustrated interacting with a lot of the local plans and information, which probably means that then when actually get to the point where they want to comment on stuff, the fact that they've had to probably spend an inordinate amount of time trying to figure out what's actually going on, by the time they get to, actually, do I want planning on my back door? The answer will probably be, F no.
Because they're already frustrated.
Hanna, there was something I'll mention around submitting a planning application and getting it validated. How many applications do you find that are invalid in its very right? And that takes up officer time to go through every document and say, that's incorrect, you didn't include this, you didn't include that, go again, assess it again. So there's that software called PlanX, which I'm sure you've heard about. And I think they work in Southwark, Plymouth, I believe, and one other council. And they try to at least remove the validation issues from the front end for small scale applications, and it's whether we can have something similar for large scale developers or large scale developments, because I think that from a technology point of view, to answer your question, I think that local government will probably need it for areas where they need help with, which is probably validation, whether it's assessing the application just to see if there's buzzwords to get through, like, you know, your development management policies, etc. And then just print a report out for the planning officer to say, tick, 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 design, and then you can put in, planning officers can use their opinion to then subjectively assess design, which is where I think they should be spending their time and not looking at policies and looking at compliance and stuff.
But then, to be slightly cynical, outside of the actual process of like the planning process, and I think you mentioned about it being engaging for the end users and local people, why are we still using A4 sheets of paper and font size 10 to notify the public about planning issues? And so it goes back to the question, I guess it's probably better, to whose benefit is it that it's remaining a paper-based analogue system?
Is it partially because it takes resource to think about it, doing it a different way, and there isn't the resource? People have got they're so stretched doing the bare minimum that actually being a bit more inventive about it takes a bit of slack in the system to allow that invention to happen.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned some of the local authorities that are doing these things, and they've been able to get that additional resource to do that above the current planning sort of applications and doing their local plan as well. So it does need that resource over and above what's already there at the moment, so people can sort of focus on sort of digitising and creating these new systems, because it is a whole sort of new workload in itself, like in sort of starting from the scratch in developing these new sort of digitised systems.
Yeah. So you mentioned around notices and in whose benefit is it for there to be notices. The Town and Country Planning Act was put together 1990, and there was various iterations over the past 70 years. So to change the tenets of the law or the legislation, to change it to more digital means, that is a very fundamental, because one is around, if you were to send a letter to someone, how do you verify that that person's seen it?
Email.
Well, let's unpack that for a minute. Because you're right, there are elements of the planning system that are primary legislation. There are also elements that are in various guidance and policy documents that are not. So there are some bits that are easier to change than others. Like, you know, it's much easier, for example, to update the MPPF than it is to change the Act. Similarly, there are elements of planning, holistically, that are widely known about, often misunderstood. The example being Greenbelt. You know, it's the thing you might see on the front page of the paper, but if you ask someone in the street what it meant, they would undoubtedly get it wrong. And there are elements of the planning system which are you know, seemingly arcane and so complex, but actually changing them wouldn't tug on the heartstrings that you would get if you tried to change the Greenbelt bit of the planning system. But could make a massive difference to the outcomes we're talking about. The example there is the data standard stuff in the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, if that ever comes to pass.
Well, actually, because we've now started talking about politics to some extent, how much does politics have an impact on the digitising of planning and or not?
Well, I would say it at the moment it hugely does, but it really doesn't need to, in the sense that I think you can create a standard for how data should be published, how it should be presented, completely separate to what information is actually in there. You could change planning laws, but as long as you have like a requirement for data to be published in a certain way, in a certain format, and so on and so forth, you could go as hard as you want in terms of changing local plan policy and everything else. Really, the digitisation of it can be separate. And I think that's what they're already thinking, is that, you know, almost regardless of what we think from a politics point of view, the information can be presented in the correct way and digitally. That at least that should be what's happened.
But then if we think about the turbulence around our government and how policies are changing left, right, and centre depending on who's the face or the housing minister at the time, And at the time of this recording, we have one, but who knows what happens when this comes out? It could change again. And what that does to, the levelling up bill or other bills of its kind to and the desire to digitise.
For the reasons I was just talking about, with there's elements of the planning system that really do tug on people's heartstrings.
Yeah.
So it does take political capital to force through planning change. I saw this in New South Wales when I was working in Australia, that they introduced all bells and whistles planning reform. Everything was included, root and branch change, and politically it didn't work. It got undermined in the Parliament. It didn't come to pass, and then they spent the next 4 or 5 years putting in place all the changes they needed to do, piece by piece, through secondary legislation to get the system where they wanted it to get to. So sometimes it's the little changes that make the most difference, not the big changes.
Not the big changes. Well, okay, so with that being the case, what should be in place then? Like what should the planning system look like from a digitised?
Yeah, I think we do want a system where all of that information is available in more accessible forms, in interactive maps, in sort of having policies more easily sort of digestible within sort of online documents and things like that. But what you saw in lockdown, in the pandemic, is like obviously there was a very quick transition to digital techniques and means, and we did a local plan examination in the middle of the lockdown where we had to fully utilise all the online resources, and the backlash you got saying that people aren't able to sort of see the documents and they can't access it, and requesting for hard copies was immense, because people still want that sort of hard copy, the sort of hard paperback local plan that they can read through.
But can I ask how, I guess the demographics of the people who are asking for hard copy and the percentage they made up of the community?
Yeah. So I mean, it was a much older demographic, because there's sort of it's much more difficult for them to access that. But we do have to consider that when sort of advertising or consulting the plan.
I think the example you use is one of many projects that have gone through that process through lockdown, and I think it's interesting because you can see through the use of online consultation tools what the kind of visitorship is at those websites in a much clearer way than you can. If you're holding a consultation event in a village hall, you get a certain demographic of people who turn up, whereas if it's on a website, you get people logging on when they want, seeing what they want, and engaging with the bits that are available on their own terms, which has surely got to be good for democracy and good for the system.
Yeah, well, this is the thing. I think planning, people forget that planning is actually should be a democratic process, and because it's not easily accessible, it's actually not a democratic process. And there is a large population of people who aren't consulted at all throughout the process, because it's not done in a convenient enough time for them to be able to access the information.
But Hannah, this is a grenade. This is something that just dawned on me as you were just speaking about the local plan in Barking and Dagenham at the time. Now, the issue I have at the moment around digitalisation is the active people that get involved in the planning process generally may not engage through digital means. So then what happens when you've got art? Because if you look at the age demographics of the UK, I'm not sure if there's more older people than there are younger people. With that disparity, is digitalisation the answer?
Well, you're planning for the future, aren't you? So,
Thank you, Harry.
the plan that Alex is putting together in Barking and Dagenham is it's got a 20-year horizon. Yeah. So you're putting things in place for people that will be there when I'm an old person.
Yes.
And I hope that the planning system then is of a state that I will still feel I'm able to engage in it.
Yeah.
I think also the key point is it's much easier to go from digital to analog than it is to go from analog to digital, right?
Yeah.
So if you've got a PDF, like we spend blooming ages trying to digitise those. They're really difficult to digitise. Whilst if you've got the data in whatever format you want, okay, fine. If people want to be able to download it and so on, that's a technological problem that's been solved a long time ago, right?
Yeah.
So I think the crucial point is, and it's a really important point, is you do need to, and it's a problem with not just planning, but with all services that become digitised, is you do need to cater for people who aren't as digitally literate. But that's not a reason not to do it. If you see what I'm saying. I mean, it's easier going one way than the other. And
I guess it's the point of access is that if you're accessing more people, you can still do your 6 p.m. town hall. It's just you're giving a lot more options that weren't there. And we should be engaging the youth in what the future of their spaces look like. We should be politicizing the youth about consulting and improving on areas, because at the end of the day, they will be the ones who are left with it in the long term. I
was going to also, COVID, I think if anything was the number one catalyst of a digital revolution, it was probably COVID, because I think I attended a planning committee online and all of the considerations were done online, and we got planning permission for like 400 homes at the conference. I was sitting in my shorts, I had my shirt on. So I think that it's interesting to see what the negative aspects of existence has on how we can obviously digitize, and particularly with planning determinations, the local plan consultation that you said we did online, which was quite phenomenal. And hopefully this issue with the housing crisis that we're in, I don't think it's a big enough problem for people to actually want to say, you know what, we now need to make a massive change towards digitization. But I don't know if anyone else has got an opinion on that.
Well, I would say that what we did learn from the pandemic is because of that sort of immediate change between everything being sort of accessible through sort of paper-based means to being completely online, people did find that very difficult to catch up with, and there was sort of a big sort of backlash about that. But what we did find is sort of eventually, once we sort of got people into sort of understanding where the information was and how you can access it, people were quite happy, looking at it and getting through it. So I think that's something that the government does need to do is find that kind of sort of middle ground or balanced approach where you are bringing people into a more digitised planning system, but it's done in a way where people are sort of catching up with it and they get to understand how the change is happening. Hi, my name is Alex Philpot from Be First. I've just been discussing digitising the planning system on the Property Development Book Club podcast at City Hall.
My name is Harry Quartermain. I'm a chartered town planner, planning consultant, and I have been talking about digitising the planning system on the Property Development Book Club podcast in City Hall.
My name's Josh Pink from Landstack, and I've been talking about digitising planning on the Property Development Book Club podcast.
I'm Adewole, director at Ademolake, and you are watching season 2 of the Property Development Book Club podcast, sponsored by Mood and Space.
One of the issues is how not just if it's digitised, but how it's digitised, what it actually looks like, what the user experience is. So much of a person's interaction with government online is designed so that the user interface is actually user friendly and you can kind of find your way through it. That isn't the case with planning portals. Like you look at iDocs, which is the system that
everyone uses.
It's obtuse. Really like it's you get pages and pages of file names of PDFs that you've got to work out what's what, and as a planning consultant it's difficult. So as a member of the public it's almost impossible.
I just wonder why they do that as well. Like, why can't they just link an application instead of having it this is a real big bugbear for me. It's just an obvious way to make life a little bit easier for the end user.
Well, I was re-listening on the way over here to the LPA showcase that the central government ran recently, and one of the things that came out of that was that one of the biggest issues was getting the information out of iDocs and putting it into anything else. So, it's that kind of black boxing of digital solutions. So the extent where open data surely has got to be.
It's a really interesting question, which is also how far does the government go, and then at what point kind of does the private sector, so to speak, take over? And I think that's a really difficult question to answer, because in some ways I think the government should, as much as they can, incentivise local authorities to publish it in an open way, but then it should then be free for all, because the private sector brings competition, innovation, all these sort of things that is quite difficult often for the government to do. But there's a level that I think we probably all agree at the level this is. There's a level at which it should be open and free. It in the way that it supposedly is now, it should be just much better. The UX point is really important.
And that's why land registry and what they've done with Geovation. And with the fact that they made all of the data sets free, is innovated the likes of Landstack, Searchland, Land Insight. Because without land registry making that information available, there is no way that you guys will have the resources to be able to purchase that level of information.
Yeah, absolutely. And also the Ordnance Survey as well.
Ordnance Survey,
same thing.
yeah, correct.
Yeah, the land registry is not cheap, but it's worth it. I mean, that is an interesting point as well. Is I'd love to have a discussion, maybe not for today, but on options and things within land registry titles.
Okay.
In terms of how people could bring that and digitise that. That's all, the number of people that are all, I mean, it funds the land registry, I understand that, but the number of people that are probably all buying the same land registry title, spending £3, it's unreal. I mean, we have a system to do it through, and we see people, the number of titles that are bought every day is like ridiculous. And that's something where it doesn't, there's still, obviously there's personal information, GDPR issues within that, but the fact that there's an option agreement on a piece of land, the fact that there's all these different things which could make the land market itself function much quicker if people could just go, that piece of land's option, that piece of land is controlled. Things like that would help massively. And it's in some ways it's a barrier to entry. I knew you would like that.
What if you took it a step back when you talk about like planning, zoning, and the consultations that have been on around that planning, and so maybe that's not for land registry, but digitizing the planning around a piece of land, that speeds up the process also for developers, but in understanding as to how many people have been consulted already, and so not having to replicate.
So
that
the framework of what you just mentioned. When you look at the digital local plans that you talk about, the interactive maps, a lot of the information in the infrastructure is already there, and it's functioning and it works. So I was looking at a site that I found on a software, Searchland. So I found the site and I went on, but the issue is when I went onto the digital local plan, it told me all the issues, greenbelt, protected, this, that, and the third. So my thing now is, how do we make those digital local plans more interactive and it's more user-friendly? Because they're not user-friendly and they're not the easiest to read.
Yeah, and I think sort of you think back to sort of when I sort of got into planning, sort of playing those sort of games or sort of city building games, that all that information is right in front of you to make those decisions about the congestion, the housing need, sort of flooding and all that kind of stuff. So if you had all that information in front of you, it's much easier to make those decisions about where development should go. But the problem is that in those sort of games, you're not having to consult with the community as well. So that's the other thing, is like you've got all these different technologies coming in, but how do you build in sort of community consultation and allowing people to get sort of better access to that information? Because it is all really useful stuff that people would want to see about where the housing allocation is it impacted by flooding and greenbelt and things like that. Having all that information all there in one place will make it much easier for people to get involved, but it's just how do you connect that?
Pulling it all together in one place is great, and I think the government has done some steps towards that, but as with any database, it's only ever as good as the data you put into it. So I was looking at the national map of planning data that's released recently, and looking at there's brownfield registers on there and stuff, and you can see that some of that is quite old. So it's a round of applause for actually getting this far, but then you need to work out what data's going into it and verify that data.
For example, the greenbelt map that they publish every year on data.gov, there was a year they published it probably 2-3 years ago where the greenbelt for Cheltenham was just missing. Right, just wasn't there. Right. So if you download that and you trust that, then you're thinking, well, blimey heck, there's no greenbelt there. Off we go. And yet, there was huge gaps in it and huge problems in the data. And I think that's potentially something that is with that data is wrong. I think that's why, as I was alluding to earlier, with the public and private sector, is I think the government probably, in my opinion, would need to build these systems for the public, for the general public, for ease of use. If you want hardcore planning and you want to do sort of serious site finding and things like that, that's not really the government's job to build a tool for that. But they need to make the data really available so that the private sector can innovate. And then it's competition. It's like it kind of is now, but it would be like it is now on steroids in that sense. There would be hundreds of companies. The ease of access would be really useful, and then people could start applying machine learning and all these other different things to it, which would then make the process so much easier. All the companies that are like mine and others that are doing it now are spending a huge amount of time re-digitizing and digitizing all this information, if you see what I'm saying. That's that in terms of, it's an interesting conversation to have as to where the government should stop and who they should design for as well. I think probably speaking, the everyman.
But so, if just for the everyman and not for the privatised on steroids version and women, thank you for including us. For the everyman and for the general public, what should it look like? That is what the question. What should it actually be functioning as? And obviously, Australia is a really good example. But what are we aiming for?
Well, you know, the general public's interaction with planning, generalisation here, is about how it affects them.
Yes,
right.
Yeah,
So it's about, you know, what's happening in my neighbourhood, around, you know, the houses either side of my house. You know, how's that going to affect me? So that's about consultation to a large extent. It's about to what extent they are either informed or they go seeking this information. And again, there's more that can be done very simply now.
There's a flood map tool that the government have created. It's obviously the classic government style, which literally just starts with, it doesn't present you with a map or anything else, just says put your postcode in, right? Yeah. And so in some ways, maybe it should be that. It's put your postcode in, off you go, and great, here's your postcode, maybe even here's your house, here's what's going on around you. And then I think the important thing would be, and this is probably the more difficult bit, is to then, how do you explain what an allocation is to, you know, someone who doesn't know? You'd have to explain, you know, what is a SSSI, for example? Is it good or is it bad? If someone sees huge purple splodges and, you know, they're gonna, you know, who knows what that might think. But I think that's kind of, I would go along that sort of route. It needs to be, you know, really simple and easy, just to go to, right, here's where I'm living, here's what's going on. That's what I would suggest.
Yeah, I mean, sort of just thinking, sort of we've got all these really good ideas and innovations and technologies coming out from different local authorities and private sector companies. But what local authorities need to know is, what is the package that all means? Like, what does it mean in terms of adding all that information, and how does it get used? Do we need to sort of plan replan the planning system around the sort of package that's developed to say, well, now we've got all this sort of interactive AI system, like this is how you can sort on the application, this is how you get people involved, and this is how you assess it based on sort of this new way of looking at the data.
Isn't that all tied back to what the regulations require though? Because one of the issues we've got at the moment is there's lots of potential for innovation, but every time you try something new, you then have to tie yourself in knots to demonstrate how the new thing is just as good as the old thing, which is required by the regs. You know, the requirement for you know, for site notices, you know, being
it has to be physical, etc., etc.
Yeah, but why does it have to be a physical A4 piece of paper? Why can't it be a digitized board that is in your stations, as advertised, you know, in your spaces? Why does it have to be that?
Because there's not many stations enough to sustain.
I mean, even if you think about the toll terms, if you think about the wayfinding interventions they have that are now digitized, that could be where you just say, a retail shop is changing in your area. Click here to find out more. That's it. And if you could break it down, so, and I guess it's the point about resource, but the regulations, yes, there is a specific way it says that it has to be, but that could be converted to digital means of communication.
There's also a way of writing regulation that should be investigated, that means that a minimum is required, a minimum standard is required, but doesn't stop innovations from doing other things that meet those standards. If they're really specific, then it stops everything else from happening.
Yeah, but you also have to think, like, are we just sort of tweaking the legislation to sort of meet the usual processes that we've been doing things? Like you say with the site notices, I mean, we've tried before to put like little QR codes and make it a bit more digital, but no one really used them. We have to think, is that really the best way that we're actually sort of getting people involved in the planning system and sort of getting sort of consultation responses? Maybe it's we have to think a bit bigger and say, well, what is the actual sort of way that we need to get people involved in understanding planning applications and commenting on them, because it's obviously not working the way it is at the moment.
But I wonder though, is the QR code where people don't actually use them just a reflection of how little people read the notices?
Well, yeah, that's the thing, is that, you know, instead of trying to make them more digital, we should be asking, is that really the best way?
Yeah, because you know, I think the thing around the whole digitalisation of planning that we've talked about today, one element is where we know that automation and digitalising the process will create massive efficiencies, but we also have to be conscious that there's also a human element that comes with officiating this type of complicated system. So I think that in addition to what you mentioned around legislation, you could say site notice, however, you can also do X, Y, and Z, so that we're catering for the digital generation as well as people that may want to read site notices. Because in my local area, we had a CPZ, and I didn't know that they was going to implement a CPZ. I was just not aware of it until I walked past a shop, and there was, the shops, they normally have news and the newsstand, and it would say, council proposing CPZs. I'm like, what's this? So do you see what I mean? Where if it was digital and it was a QR code, there is no way in the world I would have brought my phone out to say, oh.
Yeah, because so I'm walking around in Greenwich, and there's so much development going on at the moment, and I've got no way of knowing, what is the proposal here, like how many homes are being built in total, and you sort of look on the planning application search website, and you put in the address where you think it's going to happen, and you get like 101 different things that are completely irrelevant to what you're looking for. All you want to know is just, okay, what's happening
I've got an idea actually. Maybe someone here may decide to do it. So Internet of Things, IoT. Yeah. If you look at the Samsung fridges, it will, and some Windows and Apple, they always give you an update based on your local area. So it would say your weather is X. This is happening in this financial market, etc. There is no reason why the government can't invest in updates. So you're in this location, bing, planning application has just been submitted for 1,000 homes, so your home's going to be demolished. But that type of, exactly, so all of that type of stuff, I reckon that it is well within the government's power, because the resources are there, the technology is there, for us to use IoT to notify people in a way that they want to be communicated with in a digital format.
I think there's a much more, yes, but there's a much bigger and potentially more impactful use of the IoT stuff, and that's in evidence bases for local plans and EIA and things like that. There's a whole load of equipment out there now that has a data exhaust that's just pumping out ones and zeros about air quality, traffic numbers, whatever else it is that, at the moment, if you want to provide that evidence base, you could commission a consultant to write you a very long and wordy PDF that demonstrates whatever it is you want to demonstrate. There's no reason why those data exhausts shouldn't be harnessed much more efficiently into the plan making system. You get a live feedback loop then of action and reaction, which
So okay, because we've now said like 10 different things that need to happen. Okay, what's the number one thing that we want to see done? Order of priority. I'll start with you, Alex.
I think with local authorities, I think it's we've got to acknowledge that we're starting from a very low base with very limited resource. I think what we need is obviously just sort of the very simple stuff, like what are the data standards that you want? How do you want us to publish documents, and how do you want us consulting with people in a more digital way, in a way that's that takes into account the resource that we have and doesn't require. Obviously we've got the day-to-day job to do as well. You've got to take that into account there too. So we just want some sort of very basic things that we can be doing on a day-to-day basis, which doesn't really need sort of loads and loads of resource to do on top of all the things that we're doing now.
What would you say?
Because we're doing it in order of priority, I actually agree that's probably the first priority. But I'd say after you've done that, one of the other things you need to do is there's a lot of subjectivity in our planning system at the moment. It's the unless material considerations indicate otherwise bit in the Act, which basically allows, under the right circumstances, the plans to be set aside and the officer to make their own decision about whether this should go ahead or not. And subjectivity is right. There is a place for an informed planning opinion in making decisions. However, that doesn't lead itself to efficiencies, automation, certainty. The development industry, the public wants certainty in the planning system. They want to know what's going to happen, and they want to know whether development is or isn't going to happen. And while there is so much subjectivity in the system, the certainty is missing. So we want more certainty in the system.
More certainty. Yeah, wouldn't we all though? That would just be amazing. Okay.
Well, I mean, in theory, if the local plan system worked, this has been allocated, this is where this is going to be built, great, you've got the certainty, but I do agree, just back to the main point, is I think standard, get a data standard. The problem will be, I think, that if you have government dictating this is the exact system you're going to use, I think local authorities will kick up a fuss for a whole number of reasons. But if you just say, look, when you publish the data, it has to look like this. You have to present the information in this way, and you have to publish it in this format and things like that. Yeah. That can then be applied to any set of legislation, any sort of local plan process you want. And then you can get 320 people to go mental, design the system how you want, use who you want to do it. But if the legislation says it has to look like this and has to, at minimum, your requirements have to be X, Y, and Z, then I think you'll get what you want. Okay, yes, you might get 320 different colours and all the various different things, but the sort of foundations will be there. I think that's step one. And then you'd want to do a lot more than that. But I think that's step one. Yeah, and it would make everyone in the industry's job easier. And I think that would also help the public as well. Yeah. And I don't think, the one thing you want to try and avoid is cost, I think, because that's going to be one of the big problems that local authorities have is like, great, you've told me I need to completely rebuild my system. I can't spend anything. If you look, some of them look like they're held together by pieces of string at the moment. And so, is saying to them, you have to completely trash that and do something new. No, I think if you just said, look, it has to be presented this way, although I think one of the second problem is then fund local government much more. I
think.
Go on. No, add to that.
Well, I was only going to say that the planning system we've got at the moment is a relic. It's a relic of the 20th century. And if you look around the world, often in planning particularly, we view the UK planning system as this like beacon of how it should be done around the world. But I think if we looked around to other parts of the world, we would be able to see how it's done better, and we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are some great examples. Australia is 10 years ahead of us easily in terms of simplifying and streamlining the system using digital. Because it's not about using digitizing the system for the sake of it. It's about using that as a means to the end, and the end is a system that works better.
Yeah, and I wonder, in terms of the resourcing issues that we have in the planning and local government, if digitizing or automating some of these exercises would free up people's time and solve some of that resourcing issue. Okay, what's your number one?
So my number one, and I'll give a number two. Number one is that we need a a non-political entity that directs the affairs of what all local authorities should be doing. So what I'm basically saying there is, if you have an entity that is not subject to changes with the housing minister, and they're able to dictate how things are meant to happen from a digitalisation point of view, I reckon that in itself should solve a lot of problems, and have the authority and the delegated authority by the government to be able to put these initiatives in place and also police people that are not doing it as well. So that's number one. And the second thing, which is the most important above all, is user experience. Because user experience is how my grandma's going to interface with the planning system, how my daughter may say, oh, what's that? Why is that there? And this house is so small and that tower block's there. So it's just a matter of just user experience and just considering all the ages. Because when you do your local plans, I've seen our local plan at Be First and Barking and Dagenham, you always see the drawings of little kids drawing, and it shows that everyone is engaged in their community. So how do we make the user experience for people that are not technical, non-technical, all the way to the most technical who we are? How do we experience the system? So I think user experience is very important.
Yeah, I think the use of the word technical there's sparked another thought, which is planning is full of technical specialisms, right? So you got your transport modelers, your flood modelers, having a speciality of a data analyst, getting people into the system who are trained in data management, data analytics, because there's a whole lot of this data which local authorities have got lying around, which they don't know about, and pulling it together and putting it to use. The data is the new gold, right? You need to be able to harness what you've got and make it useful. People like myself and Alex who are like planners, we're often the kind of the glue that binds all these other technical specialisms together. We don't need to know everything about data. I think it would be unreasonable to expect that, but we know now there is a role for that and it needs to be championed.
I have one more question, and just before we wrap up, is, do you think, and to your point, it's the role of local government and the public sector to deal with the issues around planning, or do you think it's a private issue and we should privatise the process and make it a free-for-all?
Well, yeah, there's a selfish answer to that, and then there's the correct answer, right? The selfish answer is obviously private companies would love, in some ways, they love the fact that it's so bad, right? Because that's an opportunity. But I do think, it's the job of local authority. Well, the data comes from the local authorities themselves, right? So it's not, the problem with doing the private sector is it is literally someone in the local authority presenting the data in some way, and then someone else just going, well, they've done that not the way it should be, let's do it the right way. That's just incredibly inefficient, and you're still paying someone to do it. So why not? The logical answer is just basically, this is the way you should do it that way. That fixes the whole problem, if you see what I'm saying. So it has to be publicly done. Obviously, then I think, once the data is there and it's presented in a good way, you can then the private sector is then great. Then what innovations can you bring around? For example, automatically assigning a call for sites, right, or assessing call for sites. That's something that if you have all the data is there in theory, all the sort of constraint data and everything else, you should be able to come to a really clear idea about which sites should or shouldn't come forward and so on. That's the sort of power that you can have, but the problem is the foundations aren't there. So sorry, quick answer is public.
Public?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, I think obviously the decision-making aspect of planning, so in the political agenda setting, growth targets through the local plan, that needs to be, as a public service. Equally, the decision making again, so the actual signing off applications should be, it's a democratic. There's no way you can do that through the private sector. That said, if you look at the amount of private sector people who are working in the public sector, through the likes of Capita and others who are providing staff to the local authorities now, arguably the system is already being run by the
BeFirst is an example.
Well, slightly is an interesting example because BeFirst is an example, but that's still wholly owned by the council. But but BeFirst also have their consultants that they use, who are private sector consultants. So there is already a high level of private sector involvement in the public sector system.
Yeah, I mean, I've always found it very odd that you have a consultant working on a year, then submits it to the public sort of local council to get that assessed. They spend 3 months marking their homework, and then they've got to wait the sort of response back and trying to work through the comments that the council have sort of made on that application and what changes need to be made. Why can't that just be a system that both of the private and the public sector work together to come to a solution on what the site should be delivering in terms of affordable housing? What are the limits on viability and the amount of public space that can be delivered? Make those decisions there and then. And sort of saying about BeFirst, we've got our own sort of development team and sort of the planning team as well, who are sort of working on a regular basis, sort of working out what would that policy mean, like what do we need to deliver, how should we be shaping that scheme, and it comes to sort of really good results because you've sort of worked together throughout that process rather than you sort of just passing it from one side to the other, and you're all sort of trying to working out what do they want and why have they done this or anything like that.
And so we're looking for more collaboration. Yeah. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I totally agree. And there's a philosophical point around, if you had the opportunity to create the world, what position would you put yourself in? That's question number one. And then the second question would be, if you were then to wake up in your new world, what would you be if you wasn't that person and you were the least person? So the reason I raised that point is to say that the public sector, the private sector, if you gave them the opportunity to create the world, it'll be looking like, what's the movie, Tokyo 3000? There will be buildings everywhere. Like it just you wouldn't have breathable spaces. It would just be horrible. So I feel that the public sector are best place definitely to police, to deliver, and to look out for the public interest. Definitely.
One of the as I feel I have to, as a chartered planner, bang the drum of why planning has been around. You know, one of the reasons it was created as a profession was about public health, about avoiding, clearing the slums and replacing unhealthy environments. And you look at the kind of housing that is created when you take planning out of the
Permitted development.
Exactly. You know, the office to resi permitted development, you know, is creating the slums of the future. You know, and that is arguably what happens when you take the checks and balances of the planning system out of the equation.
Yeah.
No, definitely agree. Okay, thank you guys. we're having to wrap up such an interesting conversation. Could have probably gone on for hours, but thank you for joining us to discuss digitizing the planning system. This is season 2 of the Property Development Book Club podcast, recorded at City Hall in Royal Docks. If you want to get in touch with any of our panel members, please do, but also please like, share and subscribe.
This is the Property Development Book Club podcast. Please be advised that the views expressed are of the individuals and do not represent their employers and should not be taken as advice. Please do your own research and seek advice from an appointed professional.